This is Harold Bailey, who lived in Newport News and that wrote Birds of Virginia in 1913. And H.H. Bailey was a large collector. And so here he is in a heron colony collecting heron eggs. Here he is up the tree collecting red-bellied woodpecker eggs. But he also collected a lot of eagle eggs. And so this was common. The collectors would either shoot adults for specimens or they would collect eggs. And they would use these to build collections and trade and so forth. I'm sure you're familiar with that. And here's a catalog from 1922. And this is sort of like a stamp catalog where people were trading eggs and specimens and so forth. And you can see here at Bald Eagle, the price there for a single egg was $15. So if you got a 3-egg clutch, it was quite a bit of money at that time. And so there was quite a bit of collecting throughout the Bay. And that's how we know something about clutch sizes and so forth, because we have a lot of clutches in museums still from that era. But at any rate, this did have an impact on the population. It's a issue that really stopped about this period with the passage of the Eagle Act in 1941. So it was waning through the earlier part of the 1900s. So the impact of that, we don't have collecting really now. So it's pretty much something of the past. About World War II is when we introduced DDT and other contaminants into the environment that I'm sure you're familiar with. And so we entered into a period of biocide being the major constraint on the population. This is something that you're more familiar with probably, the use of DDT and other contaminants, particularly for crops and for mosquito control throughout the region. It was used widely. And we have fairly high concentrations. In fact, some of the concentrations of DDT in eagle eggs in the Potomac River were some of the highest reported throughout the species range. And so there was a lot of it used here in the Chesapeake Bay, and it certainly was responsible for sort of the last chapter of major decline of our population, where our population reached the nadir in the early 1970s. Here in Virginia, only about 20 breeding pairs. And that brings us to sort of what we know about the population. Each year, we fly surveys throughout the Lower Bay in Virginia, and we're checking old nests. We're looking for new nests to map them and to monitor the population. And I'll stop here just a minute to say this is Mitchell Byrd. Last year was Mitchell's 35th year flying the survey in Virginia. It was my 20th. We've been flying together for a long time. But Mitchell really was sort of one of the fathers of the eagle monitoring in the Bay. There were grandfathers, as in Fred Scott. There was a great-grandfather, as in Bryant Terrell. But Mitchell has, longer than anybody, been associated with the population and survey. Absolutely great conservationist. So what have we seen? This is a reproductive rate, and I should mention here that this is maintenance level. So the pairs have to be producing this many chicks in order to replace adult mortality and for the population to be stable. And so what actually brought the population down from the 40s to the 1960s was that we were not producing enough chicks to offset mortality. And it wasn't until DDT was banned in 1972 and a little bit later than that that we reached maintenance levels. So you can see here that we reached maintenance levels about 1980, and we have been above maintenance every year since then. So the population reached sort of a plateau here in terms of reproductive rates, and notice that the one survey that we had in the 1930s, which was pre-DDT, the Bryant Terrell survey, is fairly even with what we have now. So we have sort of recovered our reproductive rate, and the population has been growing tremendously because of that. And so this is actually an old graph. It doesn't come up to present, but you can see the exponential growth that we've had. This is the recovery goal that was set in the 1970s. You can see that we went right through that in the mid-1990s and kept going. And currently we're about 4 to 5 times higher than what the initial recovery goal was. Last year we were at about 730 pairs here in Virginia. So the population has been growing exponentially with a phenomenal doubling time. We've been growing at 8 to 10% per year since the 1970s. Just tremendous growth. And I wanted to show you some of that. So this is when the population sort of reached a low in 1970. Here's the nest that we knew of, these red dots here. And I'll show you some decadal changes from the survey. You can see that by 1990 we were over 100 pair, and the population is starting to sort of get some traction here. And this is 2010. I didn't put a slide in here for 2011, but it's another 10% higher. So the Chesapeake Bay population overall is approaching now probably about 1,500 pair. And we estimate from some modeling that maybe the maximum might be something like about 2,000 pairs. So we are coming right on along here towards some type of saturation. So there's the change that we've seen. This was in 2010. We're considerably above that value now. Tremendous recovery. One of the greatest conservation success stories of our nation's history. So it turns out that this period here, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring period, was actually relatively short-lived, and it's what we would refer to as a demographic perturbation. That is, reproductive rates were down, we removed DDT, reproductive rates rose again, and the population has responded and recovered. And we have recovered back to probably well above what we were before the 1960s. I would say the population right now is probably as high as it's been in 300 years because of all these earlier periods of constraints on the population. The population has been released to truly recover. So something about the population, habitat loss due to land clearing and commercial fishing. There was a bottleneck there in that period. Population suffered from collecting and shooting eggs and specimens. I didn't mention that there was also a bounty in this area because they were believed to compete for fish and other things. So it was a bounty, similar to the bounty that was offered in Alaska that's so famous. DDT resulted in a dramatic decline. Population reached a low in the early 1970s, and the population has been dramatic. So what ended these different eras here, you can see, we had reforestation, the Eagle Act, ended most of the shooting and all because of the penalties for doing that. Ban on DDT ended the biocides. Now since 1980, we've entered into sort of another era of constraints. That is our expansion of the human population on the landscape. These are a series of pictures here from the Upper Potomac where we've seen truly industrial scale development, consuming habitat, and that development is sort of rolling down the Potomac out of DC. And it's being fueled from tremendous resources there. And here's an example of that. This is the human census. This is human population census put graphically into census blocks. That's what this map shows. This is the census from 1949. And I'll show you how that's changed up to 2000. So we are expanding out of these population centers and we're consuming habitat. And really that's one of the true concerns that we've had. And we've been working on that at the center for the last 20 years, trying to understand, what types of patterns are we seeing? Are there refugia within the landscape? And there are. We have refuges, but not only do we have sort of ownership refuges, Nature Conservancy properties, Fish and Wildlife Service refuges, state refuges. We also have what we refer to as policy refuges, like the Wetland Acts and so forth, which protect certain habitats that eagles are actually using. So we have considerable refugia within this system that will allow eagles to sort of exist within the landscape, even though we consume quite a bit of it. So we've been studying these things for quite a while. And one of the most sort of surprising things that we have had, and we didn't expect this in the 80s and 90s, is that eagles increasingly are starting to live with humans. This is a nest up on the Potomac, and it's right in this guy's backyard next to his pool. And this family here uses the backyard plenty, and this eagle pair seems to be okay with that. And so we're seeing more and more of that. And this is sort of what we hoped for, because if we're consuming more and more of the land with residential development, our hope then is that eagles can adapt what they're doing and be able to exist with us. And that way there's more habitat available. And the best examples we have of that are where? Here in Tidewater. Reese follows a number of pairs that are in these residential neighborhoods. This pair here in Botanical Gardens is an example of that. Incredibly tolerant pair to human activity. And with that habituation to human activity, the hope is that they can sort of move their niche toward us and we can be together. And long term, as we consume more and more habitat, that's really the hope. But it's not just a matter of habitat. And so there's a lot of indirect effects that we see from our existence on the landscape that impacts eagles in different ways. This is a chick. This was only 2 weeks ago. This was in Pocosin. There's a nest near this pole. And when this bird fledged, it moved over onto this pole and was electrocuted and taken down. But this is something we're seeing throughout the Bay, wherever eagles coincide with us and the infrastructure that we need for our own existence. I want to show you some of the things that we're working on related to this. This is a project we've been doing for quite a while. This is Aberdeen Proving Ground, which is a military installation in the Upper Bay in Maryland, just above Baltimore. And these are eagle mortality events over the last 20 years. And they have had about 70 of these over the past 20 years of birds either hitting wires or being electrocuted. And so they contacted us to do some research to help them to prioritize lines for retrofitting and for burying, because they knew they had an eagle mortality problem there. And so that is what has actually led to the tracking. We have outfitted about 70 birds, this was in 2007 and 2008, with satellite transmitters. These are actually GPS satellite hybrids. This is the GPS antenna here, this little bump here, and this is a satellite antenna here, solar powered here. So this unit is an incredible piece of technology. It collects data, GPS locations, stores it in a database, and transmits it through satellite to us, and we get that database on locations. So this is a typical backpack harness transmitter configuration. So we have fitted this bird with a backpack harness and transmitter. Here you can see some birds, some photographs of birds. You can see this transmitter here on these birds. So what do we get from that? This is the movement. So these are GPS locations here, and these are movement vectors between these locations. This is for one bird for about 3 months or so. And this is Aberdeen Proving Ground here. And so with this cohort of birds, we have now collected about 800,000 GPS fixes. And we're using that data to help understand their spatial movements and their overlap with the hazardous infrastructure there. Okay, this is only a couple of weeks from one bird. What I want to illustrate to you here is that there are a number of communal roosts here that these birds use at night. So this particular satellite transmitters are programmed to take a fix every hour, and then they take one at night, so we know where the bird's roosting. And we've used this to delineate communal roosts within the property. But one of the things that we're most interested in are these. So these birds use common highways, and so the real question is, are there highways of movement and superhighways of movement within this property that can help us to prioritize lines that may be the most hazardous? And so we're wanting to know how birds move throughout this landscape. And that was sort of one of the purposes of this project. So this is some modeling that was done just this week from this data set. And what was done was each individual bird, we looked at the probability of movement. So this is a fairly complex model that looks at probability of movement for each bird. Then we stack all these birds together so we can see how the population is using the landscape. A couple interesting results here. This is a summer period, so this is all the birds we were tracking during the summer period. And you can see these hot spots here are primarily positioned along the shoreline here during the summer. You can see them here. These are high use areas. This is the winter period, and you can see that the distribution is a little bit different. This is the sassafras over here, and you can see that they moved up the sassafras, and it's sort of lit up here. And you can see that the association with the shoreline is a bit less during the winter period. And we can see this more dramatically if I look at lower probabilities. So if I display lower probabilities, we see maps like this. This is in the Upper Bay, I should mention. This is the Susquehanna River here. This is overlaid on it. And so we can see actually the broader distribution of these probabilities, and we can see some interesting features here like these bridges. These are where birds are actually crossing the bay. You can see this is an island here, and they're moving across in specific locations here. But they're still primarily associated with the shoreline because they're feeding on fish along the shoreline. But as we get to the winter, what we see is they're feeding in more inland locations. So they're feeding more on deer carcasses and other types of things, maybe waterfowl that are inland. So they're not as restricted to fish as the fish go deeper.
Hi, this is Dr. Watts. Do you mind if I record and post video from today on YouTube?
Yeah, that'd be fine.
Thank you.